Hi, and welcome to another episode of Interna Talks. I'm David Subar, the managing partner here in Interna. I'm joined today by Eddie Scheck, Mark Golden, and Jeff Yoke, three of our principals here at Interna. Today, we're having a wide conversation that we're talking about. We're talking about challenges and opportunities presented by Gen AI, the impact of the EU AI Act. We're also talking about the role of the CTO in a Gen AI environment and how it changes. How do they interact with the CDO? How do they interact with the CPO? Do all those roles still exist in the future? We're also covering some thoughts about Elon Musk's Everything app, an app he's trying to build around X like WeChat. And we're talking about some of the risks and some of the benefits, whether he'll be successful and what impediments might he see in his way. From the changing landscape of tech leadership to the future of AI, we're talking about a lot of stuff today. So grab a cup of hot cocoa, cozy up by the fire, and join us for another edition of Interna Talks. So the first thing we're going to talk today is about the Everything app, particularly Elon Musk's push to make X an Everything app. This has been done in Asia before, particularly in China, particularly with WeChat is one of the examples. So we know there's existence proofs of people want to do this, have one app with a whole bunch of stuff in it. Don't really have it in the States yet. So my first question is, good idea, bad idea? What makes it a good idea? What makes it a bad idea? What do you think? I'm going to start with you, Eddie.
My thoughts, I think you used the word that there's proof that people want it. I'm not sure in the case of whether it's this whole geopolitical aspect of it that we're not going to get into. But I don't know if it's a matter of people wanting it or that they have to have it. But back to, at least in the US or EU, I'm surprised that no one has really tried it before. Obviously, we constantly is trading off privacy. Obviously, the concern is privacy, right? When a vendor has all of your information, control all aspect of your life in the context of a everyday app, right? I mean, you are giving up a lot of privacy, but we are constantly trading privacy for convenience, from letting Google Map track wherever you go to saving passwords. So we're constantly doing that. So I think purely for a lot of people, that's something that they would want, is just for the ultimate convenience in terms of online experience or just life in general. But I'm sure there's a big part of the population is not going to be comfortable with that. And at what point does government oversight comes in? There'll be, I think, probably the opposite kind of geopolitical push and pull that happens in US or EU compared to, say, in China. I think for a lot of people it would be a good thing, but for mankind, I'm not so sure.
Got it. So you think bad thing that people are going to use anyway? That's your vote.
I think a lot of people will use it without having second thoughts.
Yeah.
Because
Jeff?
it's convenient.
Yeah. I agree with everything that Eddie said, but to address another aspect of it, we have a lot of good experiences with organizations doing what they're brilliant at and trying to do as little else as possible. And everything is a very hard thing to be brilliant at. Certain things drift that way. Apple controls its ecosystem in a very tight way. Facebook has expanded far beyond what it was originally envisioned to be. So is Google. But it was a gradual thing and not with the goal of covering the entire. X is already failing to do some of the things that it's trying to do well and only growing gradually towards them. And an attempt to make a big step into handling payments, handling other kinds of communication, handling connectedness of various kinds with other people. In addition to questions about privacy and other and control and other things that come from unification, even if it works well, it's also going to be a very hard mission to execute on. It's something I would expect there to be a lot of problems with. So in addition to the problems, if they're successful, there's also going to be a tough transition as they try to build it.
So I buy that, and I'm going to jump to Mark in a second about this, but I think that there's another player here, which is Apple. And Apple wants to control the App Store. Now, there's obviously regulations that they're trying to open the App Store, but if I have an everything app, but my everything app doesn't have everything, I'm going to want to add other apps into it. And those other apps might be ones that I built or ones that a third party built that I want to add in. Like X, I'm just making this up. X might want to add in PayPal for financial transactions, right? So now this creates a business tension between the owner of the everything app and the owner of the platform, the OS that it lives on, in this case, Apple. So I think that adds some complexity. I don't know, Mark, what your opinions on the subject in general, or this tension that might exist between data collection and the different platform owners.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I've had a chance to think about it and, of course, listen to you guys talking. I think I'm more aligned with Jeff that the ability for anyone to pull this off, I think the bar is extremely high. This is going to be tough. There are a lot of challenges. And to be good at everything, it's a stretch. So you could separate the question of, is Elon Musk going to be good at it, from the question of, is this a good idea to have an everything app? I've learned not to bet against Elon Musk. He's very determined, very capable. But on the other hand, nobody's infallible, and it just doesn't seem to me feasible that he's going to be able to put everything together in a single, well-crafted, easy-to-use app. Besides, there's a trust factor. I think he's kind of jumped the shark a little bit, and there are large numbers of people that wouldn't entrust him with all their data. Could somebody else take it on? Possibly. As to the question of the platform, if Musk is determined to make this work, I think he would find a way to bypass the platform. He'd create an app so compelling that you would buy a different phone just to get out of the clutches of Apple. That would be my hypothesis if he wants to be successful. As was done in China. Chinese apps are really independent of the platforms that we are obsessed with here. They have alternatives.
I absolutely agree with what Mark was saying. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Mark was saying. I wouldn't be surprised that part of the Elon Musk playbook for taking over the world with this everything app includes the delivery platform, a new phone. He already has Starlink, which is the networking part of it. Wouldn't surprise me. Part of the playbook includes the device.
Okay. There's a great parody of that out on the internet that announced I think they even called it the X phone, even though it was before Twitter changed its name to X. And it was going to have solar panels and self-relay. I mean, it was kind of all the kinds of things that Musk did, but all on a phone. And it was very, very funny. And it took a little bit the way into reading it to even realize it was parody. So you realize things like that. You're not going to charge your phone with solar panels on the phone. You run into something like, okay, this is a joke. That even a crazy person would suggest it. It's quite
Let's
fun.
not forget his other initiative. What's it called? The one that is
Neuralink.
Neuralink, exactly. You could have the whole thing embedded in your brain.
So I'm reminded of what Ken Jennings said on Jeopardy once when he lost to Watson. I for one welcome the robot overlord. So Elon continues to take over. That's our prediction. Let's move on. Companies are still doing layoffs. The Gen AI companies for some reason I keep talking about Gen AI in every question. The Gen AI companies are hiring, but the folks that haven't gotten on the hype train, or the hype train is not inflating them, a bunch of companies are still doing layoffs. So you're a CTO, you're a chief product officer. What do you advocate for? Do you go with the layoffs? Do you maximize the layoffs? Do you just try to get one big cut? Do you try to do the minimum? Obviously, every company is different, but how do you think about the problem as a CTO, as a chief product officer, advocating for change, big or little, and when do you advocate for one or the other? Mark, what about you? Let's start with you.
So I always think first about the remaining team. Think about those that are left behind and the impact on that team. Of course, you have to be compassionate. That almost goes without saying when you're laying people off. To the extent you can afford to be compassionate, be compassionate. But you've got to think hard about the remaining team and the impact on morale. Successive waves of layoffs will destroy that bond of trust, if there ever was one, between the employer and the employee. And so what do you do about that? One is minimize the number of layoffs. If you're going to lay people off, get a good sense of how much you're going to have to do and do it all at once, as opposed to doing it in phases. Because then you can say, you know, we've done it, we don't have any more planned, and you can move on. And people will breathe a sigh of relief and maybe not worry about it so much. The second thing you need to do is treat people as well as you can afford to. Number one, it's the right thing to do. Number two, that also has an impact on the existing team. If they see that you've communicated well, you've been transparent, you've set expectations, and you've been generous, then they'll feel relieved that if the same thing has to happen to them, that you'll act towards them in the same way. So that's my message. Think about the remaining team.
Jeff, you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. A big part overlaps with what Mark just said, and I agree with that completely. I lean strongly towards preferring doing it in as few rounds as possible. You know, a big one up front if that's what it needs to be, and hopefully not more. And I would regard the worst possible approach as, say, planned quarterly layoffs. And that's because I believe that the worst thing that any tech company can do is create an environment where the people who can leave do, and the people who can't leave don't. And if people feel that this company's in trouble or my job's, you know, in trouble, the people who can most easily leave, which are your best people, and you may or may not know who they are, find other places where they're less afraid of that problem. And you don't want to be left with the 80-90% that are left. So, you know, there's more that you can do. That I would have first emphasized the exact piece Mark did about treating people compassionately, having everyone see that you treat people as well as possible. That kind of falls all on both what Mark said and what I said already fall under the category of, you know, managing with your peers in the organization, how the organization approaches layoffs. Another thing that I think is important is kind of managing down, and also applies whether there are layoffs or not, which is people should really understand where they are in the organization. You know, a very extreme, which I've never done, by the way, but a very extreme version of that would be like a Jack Welch style differentiation, where not just the people know, but everybody in the organization knows who the top 10% of people are, not necessarily the most senior, but the people who are performing best at their job, and everybody knows who the worst 10, 20% are. And when layoffs happen, it's going to be those people at the bottom. And you actually don't care so much about those people. You know, you're hoping to nurture them and help them improve, but they're the least costly if they do leave. Now, I've never gone that far. It may not be real appropriate for our industry, but at least through review processes and informal communication, people ought to know how safe they are from that. And you really, I think, need to step up that kind of attention when layoffs are on the table, so that the people who can leave, that you don't, because they know that they're the people who you value most strongly, and vice versa. The other people may select themselves out, or at least they know they need to pull their performance up, and it matters.
Well, we see. Maybe unfair to Jack Welch to say this, but GE's performing so much gangbusters. It's the number one in the S&P 500 for the last 30 years. So there you go. Thank you, Jack Welch. Mm-hmm. Hope you didn't have GE stock. Well,
but it did better when he was there.
It did, but it immediately collapsed. But hey, we can have an argument about Jack Welch later and GE later. Another kind of hype factor: Gen AI, some use, some not used. I mentioned the hype factor because it seems as if every company, every startup, everybody's talking about Gen AI everywhere. Now, it can't be true that everything's going to be replaced by Gen AI. It's certainly true that there's places where Gen AI has value that we haven't created yet. So my question is, how much of this is real? How much of this is hype? And what will that do in our future, to our future, both the future investing and future of products? So I'm going to start with you, Jeff. What are your thoughts here?
I think that in general, and I think this will sound intuitive and natural, except when you apply it to the exciting hotness of the day. We have problems, and we look for the technology tools, platforms that'll help us to solve those problems. And sometimes, as now, there's something, and right now what it is AI and large language models and generative AI in particular, where you'll find people asking people like us, what can we use that for? How can we bring that into our organization? And that's always a big red flag. If there's no problem that's presenting itself or opportunity that's presenting itself that this is the solution for, why not leave it alone? I think that we actually we're not at the beginning of this process. For 25 years, we've been building intelligent, well, let me avoid that word. That's speculative. We've been building predictive and algorithmic systems that do things like optimize advertising, things like that. And we are seeing some of a nonlinearity with the emergence of things like large language models, but I think that there are places where the application is obvious, for instance, in trying to set up automated customer services systems or generate text or copy of some sort, which requires human editing, where I think experimenting with it is natural. And I think where we are in terms of the stage is those things still need a lot of human oversight and it's very risky to have the complete replacement of human beings. I think it can augment humans and allow the workflow to be tremendously magnified more than replacing them in most cases. Coding is a good example.
Yeah,
you still need to check the coding.
Yeah. Well, maybe not, right? Maybe if you have inputs and you validate the outputs, you don't care about what it did in between, so long as your inputs and your outputs match in a way that you like. Maybe you don't need to check the coding.
Well, you do it. Maybe you can do it in an automated way, but you have to do things like test edge cases, things like that. What you end up with is introducing a much more involved QA system to check those mappings of inputs to outputs. And if it works in your particular area, I think going with that is fine.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded, beginning of my career, I think you all know, audience may or may not know, I did research and development in AI and ML at a military-owned think tank in DC. And we were doing, just imagine there was big cameras in the sky looking down at things, and you wanted to identify what those things were. Just imagine you might be in that kind of situation. And we were doing some really interesting things. And then we didn't get to, in AI world in general back then, we didn't get to the hype that was pitched. And so we entered this AI winter. And this AI winter that we just started coming out of, call it a year or two ago, and we're going back on the hype scale. So to Jeff's point, I think it's true that you need to use this technology like every other technology to create value. But what I'm concerned about is, are we overhyping this? And we're going to get to another AI winter and another venture capital winter and another NVIDIA stock drops because suddenly people aren't using it for AI. I'm sure that, by the way, we'll find something else to use with GPUs. It's very handy. But are we going into another hype cycle? Are we entering danger? Mark, what do you think?
There is a hype cycle for all of those things. You could certainly apply that to this. There have been winters. AI goes back to the 40s. I mean, it's an incredibly mature technology that has come along in leaps and bounds. I think it's very hyped right now. I think it's going to settle into a steady growth phase where you'll see early adopters and later adopters coming on board. So I don't think it's overhyped, but I don't think you're going to see it go back into a winter situation. I give you a couple of proof points. I find that, as a consultant, I talk to a lot of people, and of course, people in the technology sphere are very anxious to embrace the technology, not be left behind. But I'm finding people in, say, nonprofits. There's one small nonprofit that I consult with, where the executive director she's exploding with ideas. What can I do with AI? And she's finding many really good applications for the technology, and she's pressing me to find her ways to incorporate that into her stack. And I think that's very, very encouraging. They make sense, and I think they're real. So yeah, no, I'm a big fan. I think it's happening. And ChatGPT sparked this latest wave of enthusiasm, but I don't think the fire is going out anytime soon, if ever.
If I could add something to that, I think there are real winters and perceived winters. I think the first AI winter was a real one. People really stopped, well, dramatically reduced the amount to which they were looking at it. But we go through hype cycles where companies, there was a time when, if you were a company, you were doing what you were doing, plus you were a blogging platform. And another time when, you were doing what you were doing, plus you were a social network. Well, we didn't stop building new blogging platforms or improving them or social networks. Those continued. But if you were one of the big group that jumped on the bandwagon, it probably felt like a winter, because all of a sudden just saying the equivalent of I'm a prompt engineer didn't mean you all of a sudden had job opportunities and everybody was really excited because people were properly rejecting the hype. But real work was still going on in areas like social networking. I think AI may be the same. At some point, the hype may die down, and so the weaker players, the less technical, the more casual people may feel like the environment's disappearing. But I think we'll see real advances in the underlying technology and its utilization.
My concern is more about it's specifically that the hype is all about generative AI. But generative AI is just one branch of AI technology and research and activities in general. It basically all air has been sucked out of everything in AI other than generative AI. That's actually more of my concerns because generative AI is just one technique to solve a particular set of problems. There are all kinds of other supervised learning, symbolic regression, you name it, other kind of technique for other kinds of problems that we can use AI for. They're just all quiet.
One of the things we might want to look at is some of the negative aspects that are growing out of it. Paul Graham, for instance, has been talking a lot about spear phishing, and we all know what phishing attacks are. But the AI is now getting, probably this year to the point where it can analyze your organization, understand who your boss is, and then attack you by impersonating your boss. We start to see some of those things. I'd be interested to know what other people think, the impact of that, if they think that kind of thing is going to happen, where this technology is going to start to be brought to bear, where attacks can be made much more personal because they don't have to be done by individual humans, and what the level of impact will be over
that. I think there's a really interesting play here. There are systems where people are creating AI to create fakes and creating another system to detect fakes, and they're self-training. They train each other. So, for instance, so basically the systems are in competition. One will create a fake that will feed those fakes and real images into the detector. The detector will try to detect what's real or what's fake, and then be trained on how well it predicted what's real and what's fake. So let's say it got 50 fake and 50 real. It predicted them inaccurately. It'll train on that. And then that training, what it predicted was real and fake, will then go back into the one that generated fake stuff for training. So they're aggressive systems to each other, training, in this case, spear phishing attacks and protection against spear phishing attacks. I think this is an arms battle.
It's an arms race. Yeah, exactly. We're going to see that again. I mean, look how bad the phishing emails that one gets. You can immediately tell them, especially if you have some experience, you can tell them apart right away. The language is so poor. The phraseology is incredibly weak. It's obviously written by somebody whose English is not first language. Imagine using ChatGPT to generate better emails, right? To do some spear phishing attacks. There's so many possibilities here.
So I want to move on to a related topic. Okay, so we have this Gen AI, and some's hype, and some isn't. Some is negative for the environment, some is positive for the environment. But we know there's going to be a role for generative AI. We deal with CTOs and chief product officers. How does this change the role of the CTO? How does this change the role of the CTO in worlds where there's a chief data officer, someone who might be responsible for data engineering, pulling in the data data science, building an AI system to create some kind of output, some kind of data AI to look at the output the way we were talking about before, seeing on retraining whether the output is drifting, understanding whether the output is drifting because the training was drifting or the data input's drifting. These are all new things that we never had to do at scale before. Some companies, I said, are having a chief data officer responsible for this. For some companies, it's getting folded under the CTO. How does the CTO roles change? The chief product officer's role change? Should there be a chief data officer or not? Eddie, what do you think?
I don't think it changes the job per se. To me, I may be in minority, like generative AI or AI packages in general, I think of it as just new tools, new system, new tools. So just like any CTO will have to keep up to date on the latest, greatest tools that allow the company, the team to build whatever they need to build. It's just a continuation of that spectrum, right? Does it get infinitely more complicated? Yeah, and changing infinitely faster than ever? Absolutely. But it may need more specialized skill set to deal with that. Does it turn into a new role for that? Maybe if you can slice and dice it in different ways. But to me, I don't think it fundamentally changes the job. But one thing that's kind of interesting, I don't see a lot of news or word on X or on social media is the whole compliance aspect of it. The EU AI Act is basically the equivalent, the GDPR equivalent for AI, and that is moving slowly but surely forward. And they're looking at, I think, the last I heard is they're hoping for end of year for approval. That is going to be crazy. Imagine the difficulty a lot of us dealing with GDPR if we do business in Europe.
I want to put a pin in that. I want to come back to that just for a second, but I want to go to the first point about whether the CTO's job changes. Now I'm going to argue with you for a moment, because the skills that you needed for managing teams of developers and org designs for developers, you do still have developers for the data engineering, but maybe you manage the data scientists differently. Maybe you manage QA differently because you're not inspecting code. You can't inspect code, but you are much more that automation that Jeff was talking about earlier, getting the inputs and outputs. Maybe that's much more important. And then going back to your second point about the GDPR equivalent for AI, maybe you have to understand that differently. Is your argument, Eddie, that those are 10-degree shifts, not 90-degree shifts in the CTO's job? Is that, and yeah, I'm glad with that argument if that's what your
I see it as a continuum, just that the horizon has just gotten much, much bigger. I don't see it as a directional change.
Any other thoughts about the GDPR kind of thing? Mark, I saw you smile. Yes.
I actually am more aligned with Eddie in this one. I think, yeah, there are new challenges, David. I would agree with that. But I think for the tech leadership, and I would include the chief compliance or the chief information security officer, the guys that deal with these compliance and security related matters, and for the CTO, understanding how AI is going to be beneficial to the business, understanding the risks. Those are skills that are going to be very valuable to have. As we were saying earlier, people are, confused. They're seeing all the hype. They don't know what to do. The CTO has to make a lot of sense of that and help people understand where the opportunities lie and how it can be applied to the business. And for the CISO and the related roles, CISO, privacy officer, the guys that really need to understand how to sell or how to operate successfully in Europe, fantastic opportunity. Again, it's a challenge, but to make sense of that, explain how to deal with these issues is just a wonderful thing. Again, like a lot of the things we've been discussing here, nothing remarkably new here. We were a previous company, we were selling recommendation systems into European customers, and they wanted to know what's inside the black box. How are you making the decision? Those questions only came out of Europe. It's for some reason. They're much more compliance oriented. And here too, they're going to want to know what was the decision-making process of the AI? How did it arrive at that conclusion? Open up the black box for me. That's very challenging, but it's also an opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I worked at a fintech company in the States, and when you turn someone down for credit, you have to explain to them by regulation. Impossible to do
Very difficult.
with the neural network. You can just say, here are the inputs and here are the outputs.
Yeah,
So
I think
we're going to,
wasn't thought on that. I've heard some experts debating this point. Some say, like you said, oh, you can't do it. It's impossible. And others say, well, you know what? We need to instrument it that way. We need to build it that way. This is a solvable problem, but nobody's working on solving it. I don't know the answer for sure, honestly, but I would tend to believe there is a way of solving that problem if we consider it important enough.
thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody listening. We'll be coming out with another few podcasts in the coming weeks. One that I've been on that we're sending out piece by piece over this couple of weeks. I'm talking with the CTO quickly or soon about more about the CTO's role in a heavy Gen AI environment. It's a CTO who's in a very heavy Gen AI environment, doing it at large, massive scale, and some of the problems that they're addressing and how they're addressing that should be a very interesting talk. I had a conversation recently with Peter Bell talking about CTO communities and CTO learning opportunities. And then there's some podcasts that we have with private equity firms and relationship between private equity investors and CTOs and chief product officers. So those are all coming out in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, Mark, Jeff, Eddie, thank you very much. And I'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks, David.
You too.